Okay, we are ready to begin, and there may be some of you already logged into Zoom, ready to participate, make a comment, and be heard on both the live stream and here in the auditorium. If you want to make that switch and you're currently just watching on YouTube, you can go use, if you're a member here at Bel Air, use the Zoom link that we use for everything and log in right now on your phone or on your computer, and you'll be able to see the same thing you're seeing on YouTube, but also unmute yourself and make a comment that will be heard on the broadcast and participate that way in the class. We have a lot to cover today and some difficult material relative to other things in the Gospel of Matthew. And so there may not be as much opportunity for discussion and chiming in and talking about some of these things, but I do want to give you some opportunities to jump in, maybe starting with this, just by way of review. I'm opening this up really to anything in Matthew so far. It could be things that we've done very recently in Matthew, but anything before chapter 24, what do you remember? Speak up and share. Anything you remember in the Gospel of Matthew so far that represents a conflict between Jesus and the Jewish leaders of the day? What do you remember? And of course, if you're in here, feel free to shout out.
Hi, Daniel. This is Michael.
Hey, Michael.
Well, in chapter 23, Jesus pronounced a bunch of woes uh, against the Pharisees and the scribes. There's like just a ton of them. Like Robert had a whole chart breaking it all down. So that would definitely represent conflict between he and those leaders.
Absolutely. Thank you, Michael. Other examples of conflict that we've seen so far in Matthew between Jesus and the leading Jews. Robert tells us the story of the temple tax that Jesus was kind of backed into with Peter's help, paying. That was chapter 17, I believe. Other examples of conflict. Yeah. So Lee points us to the various examples of healings, particularly healings on the Sabbath, that the Jews took issue with, and Jesus had to defend his actions to some degree when he did that. Okay. Now, all of this that Lee points us to, and what Robert comments on, shows that we've really seen this all the way throughout. And even if you go back to the Sermon on the Mount, as early as chapter 5, Jesus was already saying, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, and he kind of goes through and corrects several of their misinterpreted or twisted teachings there in Matthew chapter 6, or 5 and 6. So it's been all the way throughout. But I made a little chart similar to one we looked at last week. But this is just to show that it seems like the conflict between Jesus and, we're saying Jerusalem, by that meaning the establishment, the Jewish religious establishment, that this has been ramping up. And if you look at our last section of narrative, starting in chapter 19, but especially in 20, 21, and 22, there's all these various stories. I put a star by, or an asterisk by several of them, that there's maybe room for interpretation to say, well, he's not really directly addressing the Jews, although I would say that he is in several of these parables. For instance, you see there in chapter 21, the parable of the two sons. The first son says, I'll do what you say, but then doesn't. The second son says, I'm not going to do what you say, but then does it. And to me, that's a picture of the Jews and the Gentiles, one who will largely accept or reject, and then one that will largely accept Jesus' teaching. But we see that the conflict has been growing, and Michael points us to where this is perhaps climaxing going into chapter 23. And if we look at our chart now that we have filled out. I don't know if you remember, 2.5 months ago, we said that Matthew was a series of narrative and discourse, story and teaching, back and forth, 5 sections of each all the way throughout until you get to the Passion narrative starting in chapter 26. And here we are finishing out this picture here, where in chapters 19 to 22, the final collection of stories that Matthew tells before the crucifixion is this conflict between Jesus and the Jewish leaders, and that segues then to the final section of teaching that began in chapter 23 with his very strong language in rebuking of the scribes and the Pharisees. And I actually want to start there in chapter 23 and read the last 5 or 6 verses. And notice, we're not going to spend a lot of time here because we have, like I said, a lot of material of our own to get to. And Robert covered these verses for us on Wednesday. But we were talking right before class, not only did these verses sum up what he has just said in chapter 23, but I think they serve very nicely as a segue into chapter 24. Particularly this. Notice as we read these last 6 verses of Matthew 23 leading into chapter 24, notice the language of judgment. Particularly Jerusalem is called out. And there's language of Jerusalem receiving a punishment, receiving a vengeance from God upon them because of their sin, because of their rebelliousness, because of their rejection of God and his messengers. Just notice that in chapter 23 of Matthew, verse 34 to the end, where it says, "Therefore, behold, I am sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you kill and crucify, some of them you scourge in your synagogues, persecute from city to city." Notice this, "so that upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation." Verse 36, and then into verse 37, he mourns, similar to maybe what we think of Jeremiah doing in his day when he was witnessing the destruction of Jerusalem. Jesus says in 37, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her, how often I wanted to gather your children together the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were unwilling. Behold, your house is being left to you desolate, for I say to you, from now on, you will not see me until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" So, notice again, as we lead into chapter 24, there's been this growing conflict between Jesus and the Jewish leaders, the religious establishment in Jerusalem. He has pronounced all of these woes as maybe a final word of their condemnation. He has now then said all of this judgment, vengeance from God is going to fall upon Jerusalem. He is mourning the fact, but is still pronouncing this declaration of judgment upon even the city and those that represent this again religious establishment in Jerusalem. All right, so that brings us then into the first few verses of chapter 24, and you know that typically we like to read large sections, sometimes even the whole chapter at a time, and that would have value in its own right in chapter 24, but I think I'd rather this morning work through this piece by piece and highlight some things early on to kind of understand then where we're going as we move through the chapter. So let's read chapter 24 of Matthew, verse 1 through 3. It says that Jesus came out of the temple and was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. And he said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down." As he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Here's the question I have for you. Jesus is going to talk. If you're using a red letter edition, you see the rest of this chapter is red letters. Jesus is talking throughout the rest of Matthew 24. And this is, as with any time someone is speaking, you want to know, well, what are they talking about? What subject is being discussed? What question is being answered. So that's the question I have for you. Verses 1 to 3 set up the conversation. Okay, this sets up everything that Jesus is going to say. He is responding to a question that he has asked. So my question for you is, what question is Jesus asked as chapter 24 opens up?
Well, I'll go ahead and jump in here.
Yeah.
I mean, we can clearly tell that they're asking, when will the stones that make the temple be thrown down, right? But I think the thing that is maybe perhaps debatable is, are they asking just about that, or are they asking about something else also? Because he says, they also say, and when will what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? And so is that all one thing, or is it two different things? Is always, I think, what some people get confused about, or what they might disagree about.
So Michael has set this up perfectly. He's identified both what it is that Jesus has asked, and identified maybe the interpretation that we then have to make as readers of Matthew 24. So let's look at that. Again, we do want to start with the particulars of what they asked Jesus. First, they say in verse 3, when will these things happen? Now you say, well, what are these things? In verse 3, well, it's what he has just said in verse 2. He has just said they were marveling, and Herod's temple that was built there in Jerusalem, the complex that he had built up around that second temple that Haggai and Zechariah witnessed, Zerubbabel and Jeshua led the building of. By Jesus' day, this was a magnificent complex. It was very beautiful, and so they're marveling at that. It never got old to them, I guess. But Jesus corrects them a little bit. Maybe this is a little bit about what we should be focusing on, whether it's the externals or something else. He says, you see all these great, magnificent stones, all these things, verse 2, he says, not one stone will be left upon another. So they're saying, well, man, Jesus has just said that the temple is going to be torn down. When will these things happen? But they ask another question immediately following that. And the question itself is this: what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? So, as Michael says, we have to kind of decide or figure out what exactly the disciples mean when they ask this, right? So I will suggest to you what I think. I think in the disciples' mind, this second question, when they say, you're coming and the end of the age, I think they're putting those two things together. And this is basically one and the same thing. What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Those are referring to the same event. And I believe that both of those things, your coming and the end of the age, in their mind is equated with the destruction of the temple. So basically these two questions are asking both about verse 2 and the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Okay? One second, see, let me just finish, and I do want to let you in here. You have to put yourself in their shoes. As we read the Gospel of Matthew, and we'll say this again, or maybe I'll just say it once and we don't have to keep repeating it. We as Christians living after the resurrection, after the ascension, after the gospel has been proclaimed, and we have the New Testament revealed to us, we hear the coming of Christ, and of course we think second coming, right? But if you put yourself in the shoes of the disciples here, are they thinking about that? Do they have all of that revealed? No, they don't. Okay, and so they're likely just thinking, okay, Jesus is describing this awful, terrible event. This has got to be maybe Jesus, coming to take vengeance on Jerusalem. Maybe they had a totally wrong conception of what that was going to look like. But they think, man, this is some catastrophic event. It's the end of the age. It's the end of the world. It's Jesus coming in vengeance. So Jesus, when is this going to happen, and what will be the sign that we know it's going to happen? But again, I'm suggesting to you that in the disciples' mind, in their limited understanding, they're asking all of this particularly about the destruction of Jerusalem. Steve, jump in here if you have something.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that Josephus talks about the fact that Herod's temple very well may have exceeded Solomon's. And so there's got to be a connection there, I think, between that idea and the disciples in terms of a national judgment. You put those two things together, and it makes sense, because obviously that was I think Josephus also talked about the 10,000 soldiers and people around it who spent a certain amount of time building it into this magnificent, unbelievable structure. And they took a lot of pride in that. So it very well may be that the disciples were comparing those two things and looking at it as some kind of a national judgment.
Sure. And in their mind, that's like the end of the world, right? For all of this to come crashing down. The end of their world, at least, in a very real way. Okay? So that's the question, and I want to jump in. And we'll try to keep these questions in front of us as we go. When will the temple be destroyed? What are the signs of these things taking place? So let's look at the first thing that Jesus says about that in verses 4 to 14. And as we go, think, how is what Jesus is saying here, how is it addressing the two questions that they've asked? So chapter 24 of Matthew, verse 4, Jesus answered and said to them, "See to it that no one misleads you. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead many. You will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened, for those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. Various places there will be famines and earthquakes, but all these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs." Verse 9, "Then they will deliver you to tribulation. They will kill you. You will be hated by all nations because of my name. At that time, many will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and will mislead many. Because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come." Okay, like I said before, I wish we had some time to discuss this together. But I'll just present to you what I think Jesus is doing here as he begins the conversation. They've asked, when is this going to happen? What are the signs? Jesus actually begins in a little bit of a maybe an unexpected way. He doesn't begin with the signs. He begins with things that are not signs of the end or of these events. Okay. In fact, he starts by saying, okay, before I give you the instructions, the biggest thing is don't be misled, okay? There's going to be, again, you can imagine Jesus, 40 years from this catastrophic event. He's saying there's going to be these tragic circumstances. Don't be led away by people coming along and saying, hey, I'm the Savior, I'm the Messiah, follow me, believe in me. He first wants them to know not to follow after these that are trying to mislead them. And then, in verses 6 to 8 specifically, he tells them, look, you're going to see and hear about all of these, other kinds of catastrophic events, wars, rumors of wars, earthquakes, all these kinds of things. And you might think, oh, this is the terrible thing Jesus was talking about. He says, no, these things, they're going to take place. And I might add my own commentary here and say, these are things that have been happening ever since the beginning of the world. Well, more correctly, ever since the fall of man. Okay, ever since man turned against God and then turned against each other in Genesis 3 and 4, there has been wars and rumors of wars and earthquakes and disasters and all these things. Okay, Jesus says these are not the end or the signs of the end. These are the things that must take place. And then, again, you can imagine Jesus trying to prepare his disciples. And before he gives them the specific instructions, he says, look, the biggest thing for you is stay faithful. It's going to be hard. And as you read verses 9 to 14 and about the persecution, the tribulation, the preaching of the gospel, just imagine the book of Acts in that paragraph, okay? That before these things take place, we're going to see, the book of Acts transpire, where the gospel is being preached. They're going to be kicked out of synagogues. They're going to be taken before kings. They're going to be persecuted. They're going to suffer. Jesus says, really, the biggest thing that you need to know, right, before you know about the when and the signs of these horrible events in Jerusalem, the biggest thing is you need to stay faithful. It's going to get hard. It's going to test you, but you need to remain faithful to the end. So he begins with these non-signs and these larger exhortations about expecting hardship and being faithful in the midst of it. But then we come to 24:15-35, where we find more specific instruction that Jesus is giving regarding these events. So let's read it and again ask, how is what Jesus is saying here addressing those two questions that were asked in the beginning? When will these things happen, and what will be the sign of these things when they're going to happen? Matthew 24, verse 15-35. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then, those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things out that are in his house. Whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant, and to those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray that your flight will not be in winter or on a Sabbath, for then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. And unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, behold, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe him. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and will show great signs and wonders, so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. Behold, I have told you in advance. So if they say to you, behold, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. Or, behold, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe them. For just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory, and will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. Okay. Again, let me just present how I read this passage, and then maybe if we have time, I can get your thoughts or questions about some of these things. I want to go first to the end of what we just read. There's a lot here, a lot of kind of crazy stuff that Jesus is saying here in Matthew 24. Okay, so we've got to figure out where are our keys, where are our clues for how we should understand what Jesus is saying here in Matthew 24. One of the biggest clues to me is in verse 34, where Jesus says, really after he has said all of this stuff about what's going to happen, he says in verse 34, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Okay. To me, the most natural way to understand Jesus' statement here in verse 34 is that he is describing events that will take place in the lifetime of his hearers. Okay. Now, as you might imagine, that's not the only way that people have interpreted this verse. Some people have said that word for generation, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place, is a more general word that means like mankind. Okay, so the race of mankind will not pass away. So then if you do that, then you could broaden this out, and maybe Jesus is talking about the end of the age, or talking about his second coming as we think of it. But I think that's the most natural thing, is to say that he's saying, this generation here that I'm speaking to, they will not pass away until these things take place. It's going to be in your lifetime. By the way, we kind of saw a reference to that back in chapter 23. If you remember, he said that these things will come on this generation in verse 36 of Matthew 23. So there may be a doubling down on that as well. Okay. And Steve alluded to Josephus. Josephus is one of our best historical records of what happened in the year 70, again, about 40 years after Jesus is saying these things, when the Roman army comes into Jerusalem and destroys the temple, destroys the city, and slaughters tons and tons of the Jews in Jerusalem. The historical account of that destruction fits so well with what Jesus has said here in chapter 24 of Matthew, that I think it kind of strengthens the link between Matthew 24 and the destruction of Jerusalem. I'll try to briefly explain these events. Obviously, we don't have time to go into a lot of detail. But basically, the short version is that the Jews were always a little bit of a thorn in the side to the Romans. They were tolerated by the Romans, incorporated into their empire, but never really fully trusted like other peoples might have been, or ethnic Romans, so to speak. But they were there, and they found a way to kind of get along. But eventually, the Jews pushed the Romans to the brink of wanting to do something to them, to destroy them, or at least send a message to them. So at the time, the Roman general Vespasian leads an army to attack Jerusalem around the year 70 AD. But the Jews find a way to rally together, and with a much smaller, weaker army, they actually turn the Roman army led by Vespasian away. They win in that defensive battle. Well, a couple things happen in the interim. One is that Vespasian returns to Rome because the previous emperor has died, and so Vespasian is going to take over, become the emperor in Rome. But the other thing that happens, as you might imagine, is that having been beat by the puny Jews in Jerusalem, the Romans vow that is not going to happen again. And they are going to redouble their efforts to show the Jews who really is in power and who really has the power. And so now, led by General Titus, Vespasian's son, they return in full force, and this time they are not turned back. They decimate the city, and they destroy the temple, and Josephus, who Steve mentions, describes some pretty horrifying scenes of that destruction, including blood literally running through the streets as crosses line the roads, and countless number of Jews are crucified by the Romans, and the city is burned and destroyed. Okay, that's the historical account. And I think as we go through this, we'll see how that echoes the instructions and the warnings that Jesus is giving here. So, now that we've, established, I have suggested to you that all these things that Jesus is saying here are going to take place in the lifetime of the hearers, particularly in AD 70 when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem. We go back to verse 15 and 16, where Jesus does start to answer the question about when will these things happen and what will be the signs of their coming. He says, verse 15, therefore when you see, so this is the sign, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken through the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, then, verse 16, then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. So when you see this sign, which he calls the abomination of desolation, that's your cue to get out. Flee, leave the city, okay? Now, we have some help with a couple different passages. Matthew points us to the book of Daniel. He said Jesus points us to the book of Daniel, says this is what Daniel talked about. That refers to Daniel chapter 11, which is not about the Romans, it's about the Greeks, but it's a similar situation in which a Greek ruler, Antiochus Epiphanes, will come in and violate and cause violence in Jerusalem. Now, we're also helped by Luke's account in Luke 21, where instead of saying the abomination of desolation, it's a little bit uncoded for us, and it just says, when you see armies surrounding the city. Okay, so you put those two things together. The abomination of desolation refers to foreign armies coming into the holy place, whether that's the temple itself or just the holy city. Jesus says, when you see the armies coming into the city, that is your cue, to flee, okay? And he says, don't delay, don't dilly-dally. He says, whatever you're doing, just leave and get out. And he says, you don't want this to happen when it's difficult to travel. If it's wintertime, if you're nursing, if you're pregnant, that's going to be an extra burden that I hope you don't have to carry when you are forced to flee Jerusalem. But nonetheless, get out. flee. And again, he reiterates, do not, verse 23, believe these false saviors. People that say, oh, I'll deliver you, or there's this guy that's going to deliver us. Don't believe it. Now, again, you look at this, what Jesus is saying. He says, 40 years before the destruction of Jerusalem, he says, when you see the armies surrounding Jerusalem, get out, don't delay, and by following my instructions and fleeing the city, you'll save your life. Well, what happened in AD 70? The Romans showed up under General Vespasian. The Christians in Jerusalem remembered the words of Jesus, and they got out of the city. Well, what happened? Remember? Well, there was a window of opportunity to do that because Vespasian was turned away, and a little while later, Titus came back. When Titus came back, there was no escape. But the Christians took their window of opportunity, following the instructions of Jesus. They got out of the city. The rest of the Jews bought into the lie that, hey, we turned them away once, we can turn them away again. And they were proven sorely mistaken when Titus came back and destroyed the city. So again, this fits well with how these things transpired. One of the more confusing things about this passage, though, is in verse 26, as well as in verse 30, when Jesus, describing these events, talks about the coming of the Son of Man. Verse 26, he says, verse 27, I put the wrong verse there. But as he's describing these horrible events, in verse 27, he compares it to, or says that this will be the way that it is when the Son of Man comes. So will the coming of the Son of Man be. Same thing in verse 30, when he says, then you will see this great tribulation. You will see the coming of the Son of Man. So how does that fit? I thought he was talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. Why does he keep talking about the coming of the Son of Man? Well, I'll offer you a couple things. Maybe this will help make some sense. Maybe it won't. That's fine. One is that in the Old Testament, I'm thinking particularly of, just because I always remember it, Psalm 18 is a psalm where the psalmist prays to God, and then there's this poetic description of God getting up from his throne, girding himself, coming down on the clouds and on the mountains, and the picture is God coming. But what's the purpose of describing in this metaphorical way God coming? Well, it's because God's coming in judgment. And oftentimes in the Old Testament, a pronouncement of judgment upon the people or on a people is described as God coming to do this, right? So, just because he says the coming of the Son of Man doesn't have to mean that he's talking about the second coming that we're thinking of. He could be, and I think he's just referring to his showing up in judgment on the nations. But maybe there's a better way to think about this, which is that Jesus is not just saying the coming of the Son of Man here. He's actually quoting from and referring to a specific passage in the book of Daniel that talks about the coming of the Son of Man in the clouds. Daniel chapter 7 and verse 13 specifically, but you read that whole chapter, that context there. Daniel 7 is not about the coming at the end when Jesus returns as we think of it. Okay? Daniel 7 is a picture of the Messiah being exalted above the beasts that represent the nations of the world. Okay? It's a picture of all of the nations being defeated, brought low after they have terrorized God's people, and the Messiah being exalted, him and his dominion being proven for all of the world to see. Okay? If you think about it that way, the destruction of Jerusalem fits in that picture, because isn't the destruction of Jerusalem just another instance of Jesus the Messiah being proven to be who he said he was, and particularly the nation of the world that we would think of as Jerusalem, the Jewish people, the Jewish leadership being brought low. So he is referencing Daniel 7, which is again a picture of the exaltation of the Messiah. And so when he talks about this will be the coming of the Son of Man, I think he is still referring to him coming in judgment and vindication is maybe another good word to use for this. Vindication when Jerusalem is destroyed, and that is one more confirmation of his power, his authority, as he said these things would happen. By the way, they've already asked about that. They've already said, what will be the sign of your coming in the end of the age? Again, we said they're referring to the destruction of Jerusalem. I think he's answering, using their language, using this idea of judgment, using this idea of vindication to say that he is going to come in judgment upon Jerusalem in their lifetime. Okay. I'm good to take a minute if there's any questions or comments about any of that through verse 35, and then we'll try to do some other things and wrap up the rest of this chapter. Also gives me a chance to drink some water. Okay, you missed your chance. Before we read the rest and finish up, and hopefully we'll have time to get to, this is what it means for us. The other thing that's tricky about this passage, when you think, you're saying this is all about the destruction of Jerusalem, and he's saying that, we talked about the Son of Man coming, what that means. But the other thing that's hard about it is stuff like verse 29, when Jesus is describing this, and he says, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will, it's like, man, well, that sounds like the end of the world, man. The sun, falling out of the sky, the moon being darkened. Or something like in verse 31, the gathering of the elect from the four winds of heaven. That sounds like what's going to happen at the end. So I want to just show you, not just to address those two images, but also just to make a broader point about the language throughout Scripture that is very similar from the Old Testament prophets to the New Testament and what we are to learn from that. So for instance, Isaiah chapter 13, you can go read that. It very clearly says that this is a judgment oracle against Babylon, right? But notice how this judgment against Babylon in Isaiah 13 is described by the prophet. Behold, the day of the Lord is coming, cruel with fury and burning anger to make the land a desolation. He will exterminate its sinners from it. For the stars of heaven and their constellation will not flash their light. The sun will be dark when it rises. The moon will not shed its light. I will punish the world for its evil and the wicked for its wrongdoing. I will also put an end to the audacity of the proud and humiliate the arrogance of the tyrants. Okay? So, when Babylon was overthrown by the Persians, okay, did the sun not shine that day? Did the moon, was there a lunar eclipse? I guess I don't know well enough to know, but you see, that's not the point. The point is that this is metaphorical language of cosmic, shaking and moving and tragedy because the great world power of Babylon is falling, okay? Or, on the other hand, the language of salvation, just 2 chapters earlier in Isaiah 11, which, depending on how you read it, this could be talking about the return of the Jews from captivity when they're saved out of Babylon, or maybe just referring to the Messianic kingdom when the seed of Jesse comes to sit on the throne. But notice the language. Then it will happen on that day that the Lord will again recover with his hand for the second time the remnant of his people who will remain from all these places and from the islands of the sea. He will lift up a flag for the nations and assemble the banished ones of Israel, will gather the dispersed of Judah from the four winds of the earth. So again, similar language should describe saving God's people by gathering them in from wherever they might be. So what's the point of referring to these Old Testament passages? Because again, you'd say, well, Jesus is quoting here from Isaiah 13, but that was about Babylon, and now he's talking about something else here. But whatever he's talking about, he's not talking about Babylon, probably Jerusalem. So why does he quote a passage just about Babylon? You see the question here. Well, here's what I think the point is. The point is that episodes of God's judgment throughout history and throughout Scripture, as we have it recorded for us, these episodes of judgment, they look similar, and they happen in similar ways. So, for instance, this would be a much longer list, but think about these episodes of judgment throughout the Old Testament. The flood in the days of Noah. And then the Exodus happens, and Pharaoh and his horses are drowned in the sea. By the way, there's a water connection there, and you're like, oh, that kind of reminds me of what happened in Genesis 6. That's similar to that. the fall of Jerusalem, this is the first one we're referring to, when the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem, okay? There's similarities in the way that happened to the way the Exodus happened, to the way the flood happened, and then when Babylon falls, that's similar as well. So all of these things, whenever God brings judgment, and whenever he describes judgment that he is bringing upon the wicked, there's a similarity in the way that it happens. And so, as students of the Bible, we can identify the patterns as they take place and learn lessons about what we know is coming for us, which is a judgment at the end of time, okay? So, I'm not going to live through the flood of Genesis 6, okay? That's already happened. I can read the record of it. But in reading the record of it, I can say, okay, that's the way God brought judgment in Genesis 6. There's lessons to be learned about the judgment that I know God will bring at the end of time. By the way, Peter does that exact thing in 2 Peter 3. Peter talks about the flood in the days of Noah and says, it's going to be different, fire, not water, okay? But it's going to be very similar because God acts in a similar way when he brings judgment and when he acts for salvation. So, what's the point of me saying all this? The point is basically this. In my mind, Matthew 24 is a picture of the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. And as Jesus describes it, he's using language that the prophets used beforehand to talk about things like the destruction of Babylon. But in reading about the destruction of Jerusalem in Matthew 24, although I don't think he's primarily talking about his second coming that we are waiting on, we can see the way God operated in AD 70 and how Jesus described it, and we can learn lessons for us in regards to the second coming when Jesus returns. Okay, and this last section I think helps us the most with that, but I do think it's important, if I'm correct, and I don't have to be, to understand when he's talking about destruction of Jerusalem and when he's not. Now, I'll just say, we'll try to finish this up and just read. Maybe that's all we'll have time to do with the time that we have left. There is a theory that I think holds some weight, that in verse 34 and 35 of Matthew 24, Jesus says, this generation will not take place until will not pass away until all these things take place. There's a theory that says that, okay, everything up to this point is destruction of Jerusalem. But then notice verse 35 says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. And then verse 36 says, but of that day and hour no one knows. Right? So there's a theory that says there's a transition. And when Jesus says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not, of that day, he's now going to be talking about that day when heaven and earth pass away. So now he is making a jump to the end of time, and the rest of the chapter is about that. I think, again, that holds some weight. I'm not ready to buy into that. I still think he's giving instructions regarding the destruction of Jerusalem. But either way, think about the lessons that he is getting across in the rest of this chapter, starting in verse 36 of Matthew 24. But of that day and an hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. For as in those days, before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So will the coming of the Son of Man be. There will be 2 men in the field, one will be taken and one left. 2 women grinding at the mill, one will be taken, one left. Therefore be on the alert, for you do not know which day the Lord is coming. But be sure of this, that if the head of the house had known what time of the night the thief was coming, he wouldn't have been on the alert. It would not have allowed his house to be broken into. For this reason, you also must be ready. For the Son of Man is coming in an hour when you do not think that he will. Who then? The faithful and sensible slave whom the master has put in charge of his household to give them their food at the proper time. Blessed is the slave whom his master finds in so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you that he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But if the evil slave says in his heart, my master is not coming for a long time, and begins to beat his fellow slaves and eat and drink with drunkards, the master of that slave will come on a day when he does not expect him, and an hour which he does not know, will cut him in pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. I have 1 minute. Well, now just switch to being no minutes. So real quickly, I'll just give you this. What is Jesus stressing? 4 things that Jesus is emphasizing as he concludes chapter 24. You don't know when this is going to happen. It's going to be sudden, and there will be a separation. One will go, one will stay. Whichever one's good, whichever one's bad, there's going to be immediately, some will be saved, some will be lost. Okay? So be ready. Be on the alert and do the master's will. In the meantime, obey the master, and when you see the signs, remember what the master said and do it. Again, I think that chapter 24, even all this to the end of the chapter, is Jesus' message for first century Judean followers of his, Christians. Okay? This destruction of Jerusalem is coming. You don't know when it's going to happen. It's going to be sudden. And so be on the alert and continue to be faithful and obedient to what I have told you. But what I'm saying is, even a message that's primarily for them, you see as clearly as I do, there is critical lessons for us as well. We know God's judgment is coming. Read passages like 2 Peter 3. Okay? Read passages like 1 Corinthians 15, 1 Thessalonians 4. Okay? We don't know when this is going to happen. It will be a sudden event in which there will be a separation between the saved and the lost. We need to be ready, and we need to be doing the master's will until he returns. So that's that. I reserve the right to be wrong about any and all of that, so let me know if you think I am. And Robert will lead us into chapter 25 on Wednesday. Thank you so much. Sorry for going 1 minute over.